All right. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Keith Pearson, and I'll be the moderator for today's discussion titled Medication Administration for the Enteral Nutrition Patient. I'm excited to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Joseph Bulata. I can honestly say that when it comes to enteral nutrition and medication administration, I can't think of a better person that we could have speaking on this topic than our speaker today. Dr. Bulata is a recognized expert in nutrition support, nutritional pharmacotherapy, and drug-nutrient interactions. His long academic career includes roles as clinical professor in nutrition sciences at Drexel, professor of pharmacology and therapeutics at Penn, and professor of pharmacy practice at Temple University, all of which are in Philadelphia. During that time, he also maintained active clinical roles, most recently 15 years as a specialist with clinical nutrition support at University of Pennsylvania Health System. Now recently retired, he continues to provide consulting services from one-time focused consults to more in-depth professional collaboration. He received his doctorate at the University of Maryland after completing degrees in nutrition science at Penn State and in pharmacy at the Philadelphia College of Pharmacy. He completed a residency at Johns Hopkins Hospital and a nutrition fellowship at the University of Maryland Medical System prior to being board certified in nutrition support for 24 years and currently is a board certified nutrition specialist scholar. Dr. Bulata has performed research and published in the areas of nutrition, gastroenterology, and critical care, authoring around 100 chapters and papers in peer-reviewed journals. He has been an investigator on a number of grant-funded research projects and edited several reference books. Besides holding active membership in several professional organizations, he has served on the editorial board of a number of professional journals and been involved with national guidelines and safety recommendations on enteral and parenteral nutrition. So today is our first discussion session. So this is somewhat different from our webinars that we've been having recently. Discussions are meant to be more collaborative and include an informal back and forth among audience members. So after our speaker's initial presentation, we'll open it up to the audience to share their practice at their clinics, to ask questions, while Dr. Joe Bulata can offer some advice from his perspective. Attached in the chat, you'll find the CPE certificate. In order to claim this as continuing professional education credit, we must have an evaluation. So at the end of our presentation, I'll place a link to a 4-question evaluation in the chat box. So we just ask that you complete that evaluation so we can have the feedback to keep improving our educational offerings to you. So lastly, we want to thank the ALS Association for providing the Quality of Care grant to support this presentation. And with that, I'll hand it over to Dr. Bulata.
Well, thanks very much, Keith. You're very kind. Most people don't read my whole bio. Usually that's just to share with my wife so she knows I actually do something in the world. But appreciate it very much. Thanks for pulling us together. And thanks also to Stephanie and Amy bringing this whole group together. Appreciate it and have this opportunity to talk a little bit about enteral medication administration. And thanks to all of you also for taking some time off of work to spend some time here. Hopefully, I'll bring up some interesting points for you, and hopefully we'll have a good bit of discussion going forward. So here are my disclosures, just FYI. And as far as objectives go, I'm going to try to highlight some points about enteral medication process, review the basis for meal effect on meds, and we'll talk a little bit about enteral nutrition effect on meds, and then describe some general approaches to try to limit enteral nutrition drug interactions, or EN drug interactions. We'll try to follow this outline as best as we can and leave plenty of time for discussion. So we'll start by talking about this enteral medication process. And it was interesting. I tried going out and trying to find if there's any good articles sort of summarizing enteral med administration in patients with ALS. Didn't find any. But it was interesting. There was a paper that just came out this month on drug administration. This was done in a large cohort of stroke patients. And very long, interesting paper, but I think very telling was the conclusions that they came up with. Feeding tube administration of meds turned out to be a highly complex process with several unmet risks. I could have told them that, but quite important. So what I end up doing here is providing you with this little preamble of sorts And in case you walk away for the rest of the conversation, we at least have this for you. So providing enteral meds through a feeding tube seems simple to many, but actually improvising the preparation and administration of drugs does have a number of implications for patient safety that we have to keep in mind. And it's really important for clinicians to respect the complexity of drug formulations and their potential interactions that can actually otherwise derail patients' therapeutic effects. So kind of with that right up front, you'd say, well, okay, seems kind of important. So there must be some kind of guidelines out there, right, on this? Well, here are a dozen that I found that talk about the medication process and keeping it safe. It's probably too small to see, but this started way back in the 1980s. These have all been very consistent for many decades. Unfortunately, for whatever reason, not everybody seems to consistently follow these guidelines. And we end up with this poor adherence and patient safety issues as a result. So what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the drug use process, and then actually give you a touch on, I guess, some of the issues with drug products or drug product design. So at least you'll have a bit of a background on that. So this is what we focus on, the drug being administered. And that's great, but it's not, an isolated task, drug administration. I even called it that in my title. But certainly there are a lot of other steps, and it begins with the prescriber's order, moves on to the pharmacist reviewing the order to make sure it's appropriate. And then the pharmacist or a nurse, caregiver, perhaps the patient who actually prepares the drug and then administers the drug, hopefully correctly, and then monitoring after that. Not to be left out, dietitian colleagues, you guys are often the ones that bring up the issue and bring questions to the rest of the team, and certainly are the ones in charge with that critical timing issue between meds and the enteral nutrition regimen for the patients. And probably why we're here today, we'll get to talk quite a bit about that. So in terms of the medications, you guys are well aware of this. Certainly there are a couple of different dosage forms in terms of solids and liquids. And again, here we're talking about oral drug products, right? These are drugs that are approved by the FDA to be administered orally. The other aspect is the drug formulation. So that's made up of the contents of that dosage form. So the active drug and the other material that's in there, the excipients, as well as the release characteristics, meaning how does that dosage form release the drug? Does it release it immediately, or is it somehow modified, to be sustained release, enteric-coated, et cetera? So here's a little pretty picture, and we're talking really immediate release oral products are the only ones that we should really be considering for administration through an enteral access device. So whether it's a solid tablet, a capsule, or a liquid dosage form, obviously they each contain the active drug, so-called active pharmaceutical ingredient, or API, but they also contain excipients. And there are dozens and dozens of different products that the formulation scientists, so the folks working in industry or in academia who've identified this great, drug molecule, its chemistry, its physical properties, have to now figure out what things to add to it, to combine with it, to make sure that that drug will end up being released in a very predictable manner, and be absorbed and be bioavailable to the patient. Here's my little cartoon, very simplistic, of what actually happens when you take an oral med orally. So over there on the left-hand side, that's supposed to be either a tablet or a capsule. And when you take those by mouth, it should disintegrate based on its design characteristics into different size granules and eventually disintegrate down to very specific particles. And it starts to look a lot like a liquid dosage form. And hopefully the drug goes into solution. We refer to that as dissolution. And once a drug's in solution, it's available for absorption. Not a guarantee for absorption, but it's available for absorption if something else doesn't happen, doesn't interact with it, doesn't complex with it. And again, the whole purpose is to make sure this drug is orally bioavailable. And we'll spend quite a bit of time talking about this in the next few minutes. So just to make sure we're all using the same definition, when we talk about bioavailability, we're referring to the net proportion of a dose that's actually delivered to the systemic circulation after it's been absorbed. And there are a number of different steps involved and a number of different factors. And trust me when I tell you, there are entire reference books just talking about oral bioavailability, and you do not want to get me started on any of that. And here's a figure that kind of summarizes what these design specialists, these formulation scientists take into account, some of what they take into account using the solubility and permeability to make sure that their little product will actually be able to be taken by mouth and be absorbed and be predictably absorbed and have good bioavailability for the patients. Okay, so time to compare and contrast a little bit oral versus enteral administration. So oral administration, we've got these well-designed products. It's taken them years and years to test them. You take them with water. FDA says 240 mLs, full cup of water. Then the product undergoes its design disintegration and dissolution, voila. And you've got this reasonably predictable absorption for the drug. On the other side, with enteral preparation and administration, right up front, you're actually, if it's a tablet, you're actually destroying the formulation design right up front. So now you're increasing the potential for interaction between the actual drug molecule and many of the excipients that were located within the dosage form. And that gets dispersed in water. Now you have the potential for other unintended interactions, sometimes just with the water, sometimes with the feeding tube, sometimes with other meds, and certainly sometimes with the enteral nutrition formulation. And so it's much less predictable as to whether you get full dissolution and bioavailability in that case. I've mentioned preparation and administration, again, just to make sure we understand when we're talking about drug preparation, that's any change at all to the commercial dosage form. So whether it's diluting a liquid drug, opening a capsule, or crushing a tablet, and there are even more complex things that pharmacists may do. But any of that preparation can influence the absorption, the bioavailability, the effect and safety of that drug. And then when we talk about drug administration, we're talking about the timing of the drug as it relates to flushing protocols, other meds, and of course, the enteral nutrition regimen. Now, many times you'll hear people talking about drug administration, and they kind of conflate these two things together, and that's fine, but it's good to just understand that they are two separate steps. Now, unfortunately, there are med errors that happen, and these can actually happen at each step in that process that I showed you, and can affect the patient's outcomes. So, like, what are these errors? Let me kind of break these down. I think of them really as three different categories or classes. First being that an unsuitable drug formulation was selected. So here I would think about something like a sustained release drug that somebody has now prepared, crushed to be given to a patient. Clearly a drug error. Perhaps selecting an inappropriate site for a particular drug. And here I'm thinking in particular about post-pyloric administration. I'm assuming many of your patients have gastric access devices, but certainly for those with post-pyloric devices, this is potential for an error. And of course, a large number of improper techniques for preparation or methods for administration. So there you go, three big classes of drug errors, and they have clinical consequences. So adverse drug effects, which is really a polite way of saying drug toxicity with fatalities. So there are a lot of fatalities have been reported. And sort of the other end of the spectrum, therapeutic drug failure. So drugs are being administered and the patient's not receiving the effect. And in fact, many times, these first two clinical consequences may not even be attributed to the fact that the preparation or administration methods may have not been appropriate. And lastly, the one we never see is clogging of the feeding tube. We'll get to talk about that a little bit too. On this slide, I've got quite a bit of data, but just to kind of give you a quick look at what they call handling errors. So handling meaning both preparation and administration. And it's interesting, you go back like decades, and people have done surveys after survey after survey, mostly of nurses in practice, and asking them, how they prepare and administer meds through a feeding tube. And it's interesting because virtually all respondents are very confident in their techniques. I've learned this, we've done this forever, no problem. Everything goes fine. Unfortunately, when you dig into the survey, you end up discovering that virtually every respondent has at least one response that identifies a significant either preparation and or administration error. But as those of us know, surveys are one thing. You get some more insight when you do observational studies, and there have been a number of those done as well. And you can see here that error rates approach 60 to 75%. It should be stunning. I don't know if you're as stunned as I am, but the larger, like the 75%, those are like in ICU patients. You get around the 60% error rates, usually in hospitalized patients, but even in outpatients and patients who are at home on enteral nutrition, error rates are probably around the 50% area. So that's kind of crazy. And just to give you an idea, some of the errors, specific errors and some of the rates, preparing by crushing different drugs together, or administration-wise, not having a flushing regimen at all, or perhaps allowing a known interaction between enteral nutrition and the medication. Now, we're very fortunate. The Institute for Safe Medication Practices has continued to push or increase awareness of this issue. I feel like this was just published a few months ago, but apparently it was 2 years ago. They did a very nice, lengthy thing. I think this is available from their website for folks to review. Okay, so that was my quick run through on the enteral med process, and hopefully giving you some background, some context. So let's talk a little bit here about the meal effect. What is the meal effect? Well, that's just one of the subtypes of drug nutrition interactions, right? So it's the one on top. We also refer to it more commonly as a food-drug interaction. So meal is the precipitating factor or the perpetrator, and the drug is like the victim, and you've got this interaction. But what does that mean? What's actually happening? Well, the interaction could be either direct or indirect. So a direct interaction is physical chemical reaction between food and drug that can actually alter the stability or the solubility of the drug. It's already beginning to interfere with how the drug is expected to act. Indirectly, all the physiologic changes that occur within the GI tract as a result of food also can impact on how the drug gets solubilized, gets absorbed, and ultimately its drug bioavailability. So let's draw this little figure here. This is a serum concentration time curve. So if you have a patient or a group of patients or individuals who take an oral drug by mouth, and you have IV access, and you sample and assay their blood over time, you get something like this. So this is your serum concentration over time profile for a particular drug. And you can see it gets absorbed really quick. It has sort of a peak concentration and then dissipates over time from a single dose. So that's great, and that's interesting. But we've actually found a good use of calculus. And you can actually figure out the area under this curve. And when you do that, this area under the curve represents how much of the drug actually makes it to the bloodstream. So it's your bioavailability of a particular oral drug, or what we'll just refer to as area under the curve. Bioavailability, area under the curve, I'm going to use interchangeably. Now, if we take the same curve again, let's just say this is the curve of the drug when we take it in the fasted state. All right. And I'm going to take the same group of individuals. We'll give them the same drug, a few weeks later, do this all again in the fed state. And, oh, it looks a little bit different here. So I can tell, well, the rate of absorption seems a little slower. Kind of makes sense, right? Gastric emptying is going to be slowed a little bit. But if I was able to work on the calculus here, I'd figure out pretty quickly that the area under the curve is actually not very different. In other words, you can probably give this drug, whatever it is, either in the fasted state or the fed state, and you're going to get reasonably similar bioavailability. Okay. Now here's a drug you might recognize. Here's like real data from a real drug, one of these meal effect studies, and look at that. So in the fasted state's way up there, way down here, can you see it? Way down there is what happens with a meal, with Enteral. That's like over 60% reduction in bioavailability. My goodness, you're probably saying, what kind of a meal would do that? Well, this is the FDA's standard test meal. It's a, up to 1,000-calorie meal with 50%, energy from fat. This is your, eggs fried in butter, toast with butter, hash browns, bacon, whole milk to drink, etc. The FDA came up with that not because they don't know that much about nutrition, but they were trying to come up with the worst case scenario, the worst impact on physiology, and then see what would happen. Down here at the bottom, you'll see what the FDA says is clinically significant when you do one of these studies, and all manufacturers are required to do this with all oral medications. So they'll compare that the area under the curve, the AUC in the fed state to the AUC in the fasted state. And if it falls between 80 and 125%, that ratio, everything's fine. You can give it without meals, it doesn't matter. But if it's either below that or above that, then you're going to get other recommendations for those drugs. And that's actually how we get these kinds of lists on, oh, here's drugs. This one you have to give on an empty stomach, or this drug you have to administer with food. So that's the source of that, doing these meal effect studies. All right, so what kind of data do we have to help us and guide us with enteral nutrition effects, so EN effect studies? Let's move and talk about that. Oh, well, start right away and say data are actually very limited on enteral nutrition drug interactions. There are no companies required to do these, so clearly it requires a lot more study, very, very frustrating. The data that are there is really not sufficient enough to be able to try to make predictions, because there's so much variability either in enteral nutrition formulas, the regimens, the meds, the huge variability in how people prepare and give meds. It's very interesting. The cohort of stroke patients that I mentioned earlier, this study that just came out, very interesting. When they looked at all the meds that their patients were getting, looking for data on how to administer them with enteral nutrition, they found that there were data for only 2 of their meds, only 2 of the meds. And each of those meds, the data came from case reports. And those case reports said, you can't give enteral nutrition with those 2 meds. And that's the level of data that we have, unfortunately, for some meds. And then for other meds, there's really very little data at all. And we're really concerned about interactions. They can either happen right within the feeding tube, they can happen within the gut, or they can even happen at the gut mucosa itself. And of course, for us, the central issue is, what do I do? We're giving this med to the patient. Do I have to hold this enteral nutrition? Do I have to hold the feeds for a significant amount of time to avoid some interaction or not? So what do we do? Can we apply the meal effect data? Well, turns out that a liquid meal is very different in terms of gut physiology. So that's, there are ways of looking at it. Certainly continuous feeds are going to be even less like a meal. But in any case, the interaction goes beyond just trying to extrapolate from meal effect data. Remember, when you're taking a drug by mouth with a meal, the major risk you're looking at is whether it's going to influence bioavailability. When we're doing that through a feeding tube, giving the meds there, we're still very concerned about bioavailability, but now we're also concerned about the risk for tube patency. So we'll talk bioavailability. Certainly, there are going to be some drugs that are going to do better if they're given in close proximity to the feeds, and others that are going to be much better if you have it separated from the enteral nutrition. And again, we want to know, like, do you just hold the feed long enough to flush the tube and administer the drug and flush it again and restart it, or do we have to wait, a certain amount of time? Now, for that medication, and there are many, where there are really very little data or no data whatsoever, we really do have to rely a little bit on that meal effect data. And so we will extrapolate to that. But then, of course, the the patient has to be monitored very closely and identify if there are issues or not. And then if there are issues, hopefully somebody generates a case report so we can begin to look at that. When it comes to tube patency, there's an interesting question. Clogged feeding tubes and never event? Well, it's possible if everybody did everything the way they're supposed to, but we know that clogs happen. I think that, when people ask generally, what's a clogging rate for feeding tube? I hear people use the numbers, 25 to 30, 35%, which is very high, obviously. In the inpatient setting, based on data that are out there, it seems that, at least 80% of patients are receiving at least one med known to clog a tube. But they rarely report that. Most institutions don't know what their tube clogging rate is. They know about their line infection rates, but they don't know about their clogging tube rates. In the outpatient world, obstruction rates are approximately 30% over 1 year time, maybe close to 60% over 2 years. And of course, the really important thing is that the requirement to replace the tubes. And it's like a quarter to a half of them, on average, are the ones that actually end up needing to be replaced. So, of course, we would say, avoid modified release formulations and follow the best practices, and you're going to hopefully avoid tube clogging. Some specifics that go back to some data that's actually older data, but try to avoid administering through a feeding tube any liquid meds that have a low pH or those that have alcohol content. Both of those have a tendency to denature some of the protein that's in the feeds that, is remaining within that feeding tube, especially if it's not well flushed. And certainly modified release meds, we know, have the potential to clog feeding tubes as well. But the enteral nutrition regimen itself, again, older data, it seemed that casein-based proteins had a higher chance of causing clogs, as does some of the fiber that was used back in the day. So talk a little bit about some of the meds, so it really is all. Meal effect data, it's very interesting. So here you've got both the tablet and the suspension that both have an effect, the meal effect. So you've got a reduced AUC of 20% with a tab, but only 9% using the suspension. And based on that original data, that's why there's a recommendation that you need to separate it from a meal. And looking at the products a little bit further, the tablets, certainly the original brand name tablet, but even the generic tablets are film coated. And from one manufacturer to another, what they use for film coating is going to differ. The thickness of the film coating may differ. And the reason I bring that up is unless that's crushed to a very fine powder, film coatings do have a risk for increasing clogging. Now, when you look at the suspension, which probably costs a little bit more and may or may not be covered, we don't actually even know the osmolality or the viscosity of that. But based on the excipients, based on the other ingredients that are in that product, it probably needs to be diluted with water, at least 1 to 1. There are data on giving the suspension through feeding tubes. We know it's compatible with both silicone and polyurethane tubes, and it was studied with flushes, significant flushes, 30 ml flush before and after. But of course, they didn't test it with feedings or anything more relevant to us. So here we go, Edaravone. This is the one we showed you the slide before, and you guys are well aware of this more than I am, that the high-fat meal does reduce bioavailability significantly, and that's how you get this recommendation that it needs to be taken after that overnight fast, which the FDA defines as 8 to 10 hours. And when you look through this and, high-fat content, so you got to wait 4 hours. No, 4 hours still doesn't do it. You're still losing a quarter of the drug. When you get to the point of 8 hours later, that's finally when there's no significant change in that bioavailability. Even with a lower fat, lower calorie meal, even 2 hours after that, you still see a pretty significant reduction of bioavailability, which is why even after a lower fat meal, you're supposed to wait, 4 hours. Again, for this suspension product, couldn't find any data on osmolality or viscosity. But again, based on a number of the ingredients that are in there, probably would be better to have it diluted with water for it to make it through the feeding tube. This one was also studied compatible with silicone, PVC, and polyurethane. Again, studied with a 30 ml water flush before and after, to show that it was equivalent with giving it by mouth. But again, no enteral nutrition was anywhere near that to give us a little more data. And here's another interesting paper that came out last year. I'm not really even sure what to do with this, but it's interesting that the same group that's done most of the studies with this drug in Japan actually looked at patients with ALS. And gave the drug both orally and through a PEG. And interestingly enough, when given orally, the bioavailability was very similar to what it was with healthy volunteers taking it by mouth. But when it was administered through the PEG tube, there was actually about a 30% increase in the area under the curve. Very interesting. Not sure, why that is, but an interesting finding nonetheless. The product Nudexta, that I understand is also used frequently, is actually a product that contains 2 different active drugs. And fortunately for us, neither of those drugs is affected by food. So there's no meal effect. Neither has been studied with enteral nutrition to know whether that's the same for enteral nutrition or not. It does come in a capsule, and that the contents of that capsule actually disperse pretty easily in water, so in 10 to 20 mLs of water, and it can be administered through the tube that way. And sometimes some of the particles remain, people have reported, and so you actually have to flush probably a little extra and rinse that dosing syringe out. Okay, well, let's talk about approaches to patient care. Hopefully I'm giving you some important points we can discuss a little bit further later. So in approaches to patient care, I tried boiling it down to what I thought maybe are 3 of the important points. First being to incorporate available guidance into practice. Again, we've had guidance documents for decades, and for whatever reason, people are not always following those consistently. I would particularly point you to Aspen's Safe Practices in Enteral Nutrition. It was published back in 2017. They have an entire section on medication in there if you're not familiar with that. Aspen is currently working on revisions to that. Another paper that came out through Aspen in 2021 builds a little bit on that 2017 paper as well. Second would be to seek resources. So got the first bullet point, just guidance on what best practices are. And then if you have specific questions about a specific drug, there's the literature out there. Fortunately for us, there are actually some compilations of the literature that make it a little bit easier. And then, of course, trying to identify somebody with some expertise locally that you can bounce things off of. And the third point I put here, and this, maybe more personal bias, but I think it's important. There's really been around this whole issue some limited accountability, would be the polite way to say it, from manufacturers, FDA, down to health systems, down to individual practitioners, in not really paying attention when something goes wrong, when the med error is identified, and especially when you have significant consequences in a patient, and just keeping track of that. Not to blame somebody, not to get people in trouble, but actually to help others understand what happened, and either change protocols, do some education, come up with different medications, share with the FDA, share with the manufacturer some of this data, so we can make some improvements for patient care moving forward. I think most places now, in terms of resources, should have access to what we used to call the do not crush list. It's available. It used to literally be just drugs that you couldn't crush, so they're modified release drugs. But now they include, can you open a capsule or not? Is this drug teratogenic? Is it an antineoplastic? Like things where the caregiver is going to be, or the nurse is going to be potentially affected by something that floats in the air that you can't see. This is the do not crush list. There are books out there. I think they're Becky White's book, the one on the left, is a few years old now, but it comes out of the UK, so it's very useful. A lot of monographs in there, but sometimes the products are different than the products we have here. And then the product we worked on with Aspen on the right, which is also available electronically, has quite a number of monographs in there as well. And another, I think, very useful resource is UpToDate. And I think at this point in time, many healthcare systems subscribe to UpToDate or LexiDrug. Drug information centers usually have that. Sometimes it's actually integrated in the electronic medical record. And so you go to a drug, so here's baclofen, for example, and in the administration section, there's actually a special call out for administering the drug through a feeding tube, whether it's the granules, solution, the tablets. So very, very useful to have that. And then in terms of human expertise, I felt compelled to include the first one, caregiver training videos. I have seen a number of those. People have shared those with me, on YouTube or Rumble or whatever platform you use. And unfortunately, many of the ones that I've seen, may just be a minority, still have actually magnify errors sometimes. So they're sometimes doing things wrong when they're supposed to be a training video. And then ideally, you'd have access to a clinical pharmacist that would be able to provide some help. And there's actually a number of papers out there showing that the involvement of a pharmacist as part of a multidisciplinary team does reduce the number of med errors as well as tube obstruction. So there is, a value to that. And typically, things that are done in these programs is they promote this, practice guidelines. They train folks. They talk about it. They have access to databases. And for the pharmacists in particular, not only are they telling you, whoa, you can't give this drug through a feeding tube or whatever, they're also helping to simplify drug regimens. In practice, I still remember many patients, coming in and got like 14 different drugs they take a day. And while there may be some patients that actually need that, more often than not, we're able to reduce those numbers. We cut 4 or 5, 6 drugs off of there when you start understanding what's going on with the patient. They're using one drug to treat a side effect of another drug, et cetera. So all those things can help contribute to improving patient care. So that brings me here to the end. Just a quick presentation for you with some take-home points. If we were in a classroom, I'd say, let's all read this together, but we don't need to do that. So prescriber, dietitian, pharmacist, and nurse certainly share in the responsibility for safe drug use for these enterally fed patients. An EN drug interaction risk, any known risks are going to direct how you end up timing drug administration. Best practices should be followed to make sure that the patient's drug is actually working as you're expecting it to, and that the patient's able to get the nutrient delivery that you guys want to make sure that they get. And I'm going to throw in the controversial one here at the end, that feeding tube obstruction should be at least a near never event if you're using best practices. So with that, we'll stop here.